to this edition of Good Evening Ghana. Thank you very much for your time. And tonight, we know that in a few hours from now, the president's decision to apply his powers under the Constitution to release the three gentlemen that were found guilty of contempt and therefore incarcerated in prison will occur. Tomorrow they are coming out of prison. It's 9 o'clock now, so before the next 24 hours, they'll be out of prison. And whilst we were looking at this matter, as we did intensely on Tuesday with Professor Michael Kwe, we found out that perhaps in the history of this country, there has been a few occurrences in that regard. We'd just like to run you through those occurrences so that you will acquaint yourself with it. As you would remember, in the letter that we read on Tuesday, Mr. Litha was talking about President Mahama's step, if it happens, will be unprecedented. But it began with the history of the country with Dr. Nkrumah, who first had the concern about the rulings of the judiciary and who took a decision to intervene, a rather very harsh and brutal decision to intervene. And the story goes as follows. Some persons, one of them notably, Tawia Adom-Otchere, had been prosecuted by the state for allegedly attempting to stage a coup d'etat to overthrow the great Dr. Nkrumah, now on your screen. And so during the Tawia Adom-Otchere trial, three judges sat on the matter. It was the constitution of the Supreme Court of Ghana at the time, and they decided that there was not sufficient evidence to convict Tawia Adom-Otchere and co. for the attempted coup charge that had been leveled against them. Dr. Nkrumah was so offended. What did he do? He sacked the judges, actually. He couldn't have done that by the law, but he created a situation, got Parliament to pass a law, and then he actually sacked the judges. So that was a very major first part of Ghana's false start in the relationship between the executive and the judiciary. And then we fast forward to 1969, when Professor Busia took over. There was a downsizing of the civil service, but the real political reason behind it was that persons who were noted to be strong members of the CPP who were working within the civil service were targeted to be removed from office in what was famously called Apollo 568. 568 being the number of persons who were actually dismissed by the government from the civil service, 568 people. One of them, however, Mr. Salah, actually went to court to challenge the basis of his removal from the civil service. Then again, the Supreme Court heard the matter. The suit was against the government and therefore against the Attorney General. So the Attorney General argued and Mr. Salah argued, and the Supreme Court held the position that it was unlawful for Prime Minister Busia and his government to remove Mr. Salah from office as a top civil servant. So in his reaction to the court ruling, Professor Busia made the famous statement, no court can compel his government to employ or re-employ any person. As a matter of fact, what he stated was true, that the court cannot compel him to employ anyone and therefore damages would lie in that sense. But the context within which he spoke and the political temperature of the day indicated that here was the apologists of democracy, Western trained, those who had criticized Dr. Nkrumah for being anti-democratic now came to power, and this was their reaction to a Supreme Court ruling that was not palatable to them. So it was famously recorded, perhaps infamously recorded, as one of the instances in which another government of Ghana reacted very badly, almost brashly, to a decision that had been taken by the judiciary. We fast forward to Dr. Liman, and he also was president of Ghana. Dr. Liman had won elections famously in the first presidential election in Ghana that had gone into a second round in 1979. Dr. Liman's PMP had won the elections and he had become president of Ghana. Now, in the course of appointing Supreme Court judges, the government seemed worried about Mr. F.K. Apalu, and so even though Mr. Apalu was a judge of the Court of Appeal, and by the interpretation of the law, it appeared that all judges of the Court of Appeal would automatically become Supreme Court judges. In the list that went to Parliament for the nomination for Supreme Court judges, Apalu's name was excluded, and Apalu was also thought to be very close to the opposition at the time, the Dankwa Busia tradition. So immediately political meanings were read into the exclusion of Mr. Apalu from the names that went to Parliament to be appointed as justices of the Supreme Court, because it was feared that Justice Apalu would have been the senior most judge, and he was a sitting Chief Justice sort of, and And so he will become Chief Justice over a government that he was opposed to philosophically. That was the concern of the government of the day. So Justice Apalu's name was excluded. So Dr. Kwame Kuffour, who is still happily with us, went to court, and in the famous case that was entitled Kuffour versus the Attorney General, he argued strenuously, indeed his lawyer Nana Akufo-Addo argued for him strenuously, that the exclusion of Dr. Apalu from the list that went to the Parliament as Supreme Court judges was unlawful. The Supreme Court held that in fact it was unlawful, and that Justice Apalu would be a member of the Supreme Court and would be the president of the Supreme Court. And Dr. Liman did not publish any reaction to that, but his government didn't take kindly to that. So that was up to Dr. Liman. So we fast forward to Flight Lieutenant Rawlings, JJ they call him, one of the famous presidents of our generation in Ghana, Mr. Rawlings, the only one who had become a military leader and also metamorphosed successfully into a civilian leader and won 2 successive elections. Still very active in the body politic of Ghana, now with many more dimensions than one. But the J.J. Rawlings era also saw something like this in terms of the executive getting worried and reacting brashly to a Supreme Court ruling. Mr. Rawlings had staged a coup on the 31st December 1981. In fact, his second successful coup in Ghana and his third coup altogether. So on the 31st December, when the coup was successful, the PNDC government was created. The PNDC government ruled Ghana until 1991, into 1992 when elections took place and the PNDC became the NDC, still is the ruling government in Ghana today. For all those years that the PNDC was in power, 31st December had been held as a sacred, sacrosanct day in the political history of Ghana. It was observed as a public holiday to remember those who fought in the coup d'etat that overthrew the civilian government and brought Flight Lieutenant Rawlings to power. It was marked by military parades all over the country, and it was a major holiday in the calendar of Ghana for 11 years. Upon the coming into force of the 1992 Constitution, which had Mr. Rawlings as the first president of the Fourth Republic, which Constitution came into effect in 1993, whereupon Flight Lieutenant Rawlings was sworn in as president. Come December 31st, 1993, preparations had been announced by the Ministry of Information and the state broadcaster announcing 31st December to be celebrated. This is 31st December 1993, to be celebrated as a public holiday. The New Patriotic Party, the then opposition outside Parliament, who had lost the elections, went to the Supreme Court to make an argument led by the late Peter Adjete, who later became Speaker of Parliament. They argued strenuously before the Supreme Court that given the democratic and constitutional era, it was unlawful for the government, given that they came out of the PNDC, to remind Ghanaians of an event of a coup d'etat which had been celebrated over the last 11 years, that the coup was unlawful and the constitution that we were currently operating abhorred coups. So the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 majority, decided that in fact the NPP was right and that Mr. Rawlings cannot celebrate 31st December. His reaction was brutal. At the Elwak Stadium, Flight Lieutenant Rawlings met soldiers after a route march and declared that no court, again, you remember Prime Minister Busia, no court. Mr. Rawlings said no court can obliterate the history, obliterate 31st December from the history of Ghana. He was famously supported in that speech by members of his government, Dr. Adom-Otchere and others, who all spoke to the civilian, the military parade at the Elwak Stadium. Dr. Adom-Otchere famously is remembered to have said that that day, 31st December, was a working public holiday. How he coined that, I don't know. One day when we have the opportunity to speak to Adom-Otchere, who is still happily still with us, recently chairman of the Ghana Gas Company, we may ask him what he meant then on that day by saying that 31st December 1993 was a working public holiday. So this was the trajectory of what had been happening in Ghana. Enter J. Kuffour in 2000, when the NPP famously won elections again. The last time the NPP had been in power was in 1969. The NPP won elections again, and what happened? Mr. Kuffour had campaigned on an anti-corruption sort of basis. He had campaigned ferociously that the incumbent government of the NDC had been particularly corrupt, and he and his campaign team and the NPP had cited so many times issues of corruption against the NDC. When they came to power, indeed and in fact, on his inauguration day at the Independence Square, Mr. Kufuor made the famous statement, there will be zero tolerance for corruption. So there was pressure on the MPP when they came to power to show evidence of the corruption that they had accused the NDC of all throughout the campaign, and in fact all through the government of Mr. Rawlings that lasted for 8 years in the constitutional era. So the Kuffour administration then decided that they would go to court with certain evidence that had been put across, which they had found as they came into office. And so they also constituted something called the Fast Track High Court. It was to give expedition to the trials that will occur when they prosecute their political opponents. When the Office of the Attorney General began the prosecutions, it was expected that they will be prosecuted in a way that was quick and that justice will be done very quickly. It was called the Fast Track High Court. So Mr. Chachuchi Kata, who is also still happily with us, was prosecuted, and in the documents that was handed over to him, he challenged the basis of the establishment of this so-called fast-track high court. Justice Redu at the time had given a practice direction that whenever a case came to the Supreme Court, all the judges who are at the Supreme Court will be assembled to listen to every case. That really is the case in America. Every Supreme Court judge sits on every case that goes before the Supreme Court. In Ghana, we don't do that. The Chief Justice will empanel some of them. So Justice Redu decided that all judges should sit. The verdict, 5-4 against the government, the Supreme Court held that it was unlawful to create fast-track high courts in the manner that had been created, that it was offensive to the Court Act in Ghana, and that the documents that had been served on persons with the title fast-track high courts were actually null and void. This meant that the prosecution that had been begun against Mr. Chikata and others would all fall into avoidable kind of situation. Mr. Kufuor's government was unhappy with this. And they indicated that whilst they agree with the judgment of the court, whilst they respect the judgment of the court, in fact, that they disagree with it. So what happened? They went through the process to appoint 2 more judges, and a Supreme Court review of the matter was taken. And upon the review, the Supreme Court overturned the judgment by the 2 new judges that had been included. It was thought to be a low point of Mr. Kufuor's administration, apologists of democracy, unable to contain rulings of the Supreme Court in the manner that they did, and so they went to appoint people to overturn it. So that was the history until Professor Mills came in. Well, nothing eventful with Mills and the courts, not much. There were a lot of cases that the government was losing, including the trial of the Ghana 50 people, Charles Weko-Brobe and others walked off. A few others that Betty Mould was being criticized then that she was losing too many cases in the court. But Mr. Kufuor, Professor Mills, I should say, did not have any reaction. There was no actual reaction of Professor Mills that was against the court. Well, as a law professor, he was the first law professor to become president of Ghana anyway, and so I think that he showed the direction in that regard. So enter President John Dramani Mahama in 2012, and not much to do with the Supreme Court until this famous incident occurs. And as you very well know, the Supreme Court had heard the matter in which Abu Ramadan had taken the Electoral Commission to court. In his ruling, the Supreme Court gave a judgment that people said they couldn't understand, and the Electoral Commission was not of the view that they had been asked to do a particular thing. The court sat again and indicated that they had asked the Electoral Commission to do that particular thing, which is to delete names of certain categories of people from the voters' roll. Some 3 gentlemen who are members of the NDC happened to be discussing this on radio, as it was widely discussed on radio and television programs, including this program. They were discussing that on radio, and they made statements that appeared to be threatening to the Supreme Court. So they were invited by the court, and a contempt charge was leveled against them. They pleaded guilty to it and apologized and all of that. Eventually, during sentencing, a 4-month prison sentence was handed over to them, and so they are currently in prison. And what has happened, which has generated news, including international news, and you've seen all the international headlines about the action that has been taken by President Mahama. The President Mahama then decided to use Article 72, which has always been used by most presidents, particularly on public holidays, etc., to release some prisoners or remit their sentences or pardon some of them. Mr. Mahama decided to apply Article 72 to remit the sentence of these 3 gentlemen, and that has created some division in opinion in the country, all over the place. Well, as we said, we have a few hours more before the gentlemen will actually be released. We're hearing also that there's a court case that is sitting there waiting for them, a court case that is going to the Supreme Court actually to determine one thing or the other. We didn't hear anything about it today, so we're not sure yet what will happen to that one. But tomorrow, the gentleman will be released, and we are expecting a jamboree. We are expecting a very heavy, massive political event from the ruling party as they welcome what will become their heroes. Once they welcome what will become their heroes, it will be an event that you should stay tuned to Metro TV, and we will cover it. So that's the end of our narration of what has been happening in Ghana in terms of the executive having a go at the judiciary, if you can call it that. We wait to see how this pans out. Tomorrow they'll be released, and the NDC people are very, very jubilant over this action by the president of Ghana. Here is the NDC.
From victory to victory, the NDC shall lead. Democrat, Ghana, our strength in unity. From victory to victory, the NDC shall lead. Democrat, Ghana, our strength in unity. Victory! Victory! It's our land. Victory! It's our land. From victory to victory, the NDC shall lead. Democrat, Ghana, our strength in unity. From victory to victory, the NDC shall lead. Democrat, Ghana, our strength in unity. Victory! Victory! It's our land. Victory! It's our land.